All right. Good morning, everybody. Today we are going to finish the last little bit here of Topic 5, Unit 5 of Agriculture. This will not take more than probably 5 or 6 minutes. This will be a very short video. Um, I also want to remind everybody, and this is critically important, so please, it only appears as about half of the students are watching these videos from the counts I'm getting from YouTube. Please remind your classmates that on Sunday at 4 p.m., you will be receiving your ticket to take this AP test. And you'll get that through your email or on AP Classroom. So if you have not been receiving emails from the College Board, you'll still be able to access that on AP Classroom. It is absolutely imperative that everybody goes out and makes sure that they have that email, because on Tuesday at 3:30, you deciding you don't have that email, there's not anything we're going to be able to do to help you with that. So if you don't get it on Sunday, you need to let me know ASAP. Now, that probably won't come until at least 4 p.m., so don't be expecting it Sunday morning when you get up. But Sunday afternoon, about 4 p.m., they should be sending you your email ticket for Tuesday's AP test. So please check for that on Sunday. Please let me know if you do not have that, and I will help you kind of get in touch with the College Board to get that rectified. So looks like quite a few people are taking the AP test. The vast majority of you are taking it. But what I haven't seen is the vast majority of people watching these review videos, or I still have a lot of people who say they're taking the test who never checked in with me that they did the demo. So there's a lot of things that are a little bit concerning to me right now in terms of people possibly not having access to the test or not having access to the information they need for the test. So please, obviously those of you who have been watching the videos, I'm sure that you all are probably in good shape. Please encourage your friends and others in the class to do this. There's only a handful of people not taking it, so chances are most of your friends are taking this test. So please let them know. Also, I've gotten no feedback from anybody, okay, as to information you want me to cover beyond these videos. So if there's any topics you want me to cover, particularly on Monday, my Monday video was intended to be just simply answering questions that anybody has over any topics. Well, as of now, I've gotten no questions. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm planning to shoot that video Sunday afternoon. So if you have any questions, anything you want me to refresh your memory on, anything you want me to go over, go out to the writing prompt forum, put that information out there, and I'll make sure that I answer those questions on Monday. Otherwise, I may just either not have a video Monday or just have anybody email me with questions they have if I'm not getting any feedback from folks. So just want to make sure that I'm being productive with my time and productive with your time in terms of what you need to go over for the test. Okay, today we're just going to wrap up the last little bit here of Topic 5. This next section talks about agricultural production regions, and it talks about how different regions of the world are kind of defined by whether they have subsistence versus commercial agriculture. So we can kind of define the world into whether it's developed or developing based upon whether they practice subsistence or commercial agriculture. Now remember, the only commercial agriculture that's practiced in our developing world is plantation farming. So that's really the extent of it. All these other types of agriculture that we see in the developing world on a large scale. Now you may have a farm in a developing country that may be owned by somebody outside that country that practices commercial agriculture if they have access to resources. But as a whole, that country's economy will generally be based on subsistence agriculture if they're a developing country. Now, it also talks here a little bit about what they call commercial practices such as monocropping. Obviously, that just means one. So one crop or one culture that you may see in an area. So obviously, certain cultures tend to produce certain products or not produce products. Obviously, we talked about the fact that religions who don't consume beef are obviously going to be much more likely to be in the dairy industry. That's why we see India as the largest milk-producing country in the world, just based upon the fact that they don't eat beef. So that's something that's significant. That's related to culture. So you can kind of define regions in the world based upon those things. That last part there talks about intensive and extensive farming practices. Now, we talked about intensive farming when we talked about intensive subsistence farming. That's where they were trying to grow on every single bit of land possible to try to maximize their crop. So you see that in places where you have large populations that you have to feed. Extensive farming, if you ever hear that term, is just the opposite of that. It's just where you are not growing on every inch of your property. So if I'm farming and I just have a small farm in my backyard, that I maybe take some stuff down to a farmer's market, something like that to sell, I'm probably not growing on every single inch of my property. I would be an extensive farmer for extensive farming practice. And it says that those are determined in part by what they call land costs, which we obviously know what land costs are, and they reference what's known as bid rent theory. And this was something that was very briefly mentioned in our book in chapter 12, which was not one of the chapters that's on this test. And bid rent theory is normally something we see in relation to downtown areas as opposed to agriculture. But since they dropped it here, I want to explain this in a little bit of detail. We talked about the fact that land in downtown areas is very, very expensive. And that's the reason why you tend to see you don't tend to see factories or things that take up a lot of acreage that go into downtown areas, because the closer you are to downtown, the more expensive the land is. So what that means is that the farther you are from downtown, in rural areas, land tends to become a little bit cheaper because there's not that competitiveness of everybody wanting to purchase that land. So the idea of bid rent theory just basically says that the price and demand for real estate changes the farther you get from a downtown area. So the farther you are from downtown, the cheaper land tends to be, and that's going to influence the size of lots. It's going to influence where, in manufacturing, where manufacturing businesses go. Now, obviously, that stuff isn't going to be on this test, but you can kind of link back to agriculture as well, as that you see these huge mega farms usually pretty far out from cities, from developed areas, because the land's cheaper in those areas. So that's the whole idea of agricultural production regions. 5.7 talks about the spatial organization of agriculture. It says students should explain how economic forces influence agricultural practices. So it talks about large-scale commercial farms are replacing small family farms. In the United States, we used to have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of small family farms just about in every county. And today you may have 7 or 8 mega farms where you have these huge hundreds of acre facilities that have kind of taken over these family farms, because like everything, larger is cheaper. So basically, if as opposed to 100 people going to the store and buying something, if one person goes and buys it in bulk, they can usually get a discount for that. So the same thing kind of goes with farming practices, is that larger farmers who can buy product in bulk, whether it be feed, whether it be seed, machines, anything like that, tends to be able to get lower costs for that. So it's going to be cheaper for them to produce than these smaller family farms. It says complex commodity chains link production and consumption of agricultural products. Now, we're seeing commodity chains really in practice right now as it relates to kind of the way the food system in this country works, that if any part of that chain is broken, then everything kind of comes crashing down. And if you look at what's happening in the world today, we're seeing several links in our food chain which are being broken. We're seeing not enough people working the farms today. So we're seeing food that's going bad on the vine. So we're seeing tomatoes that are never being harvested, that are just being sitting there, and then they die sitting on the vine because we don't have enough workers right now because of the outbreak to harvest those farms. And then when the food gets to that next step of the processing, now we're seeing all of these workers in meat production facilities who are also getting sick, and they're not producing meat. So we're seeing, there's a thing on the news the other day of farmers who are having to euthanize their chickens because they don't have, nobody's coming to harvest, to basically collect or harvest the chickens because there's no meat factories open to process them. So you've got this very complex food chain, and the way people tend to produce things and grow things oftentimes relates to what they're producing and kind of the process by which they do it. So these very complex food chains are a big part of how the system works. Now, it talks again about technology has increased what we call economies of scale, and that's kind of the thing that I was going over earlier. The whole idea of economies of scale is that, again, the more workers you have initially, the cheaper it is to do whatever you're doing. Okay, at a point though, you can have too many workers. So let's say I have a 100-acre farm and I have one person out there working that farm. Well, that's not going to work. If I hire a second person, that's going to be way cheaper. However, if I have 100,000 workers, they're going to be stepping on each other's toes. So we call this idea of economies of scale. And those of you who are in econ, we've spent a lot of time on this year. Um, but the whole idea of economies of scale is that farmers who have the money to hire workers are able to produce things a lot faster and a lot cheaper, particularly at a small scale. Um, and that's a big part of how our food industry works in this country, is that idea of economies of scale. Von Thunen model. Here we go. Here's one of our models, and this is one of the ones that I think you could very easily be asked on this test, because it's one of the very few models that's in one of these chapters that's actually being covered. So I would really focus on this model if you are if you're looking at the models to review. So remember, we have those 5 concentric rings, and we have basically the city in the middle. And this is where we get into these ideas of bulk gaining versus bulk reducing products. So I have these products that I'm taking something really big and I'm making it into something small. So that's a bulk reducing product. So if I'm doing that, I'm going to want to put my factories out where my resource is. So I'm going to want to build my factories by the forest if I'm taking trees and turning them into tables, because the shipping cost of the tree is more than the shipping cost of the table. Conversely, a bulk gaining product, where I'm taking something that's small and making it into something big, is something that I would want to locate closer to the market. And we see that a lot with the automobile industry, is I want to be closer to the market based upon the fact that it costs a lot to ship the finished product. So Von Thunen's model basically has all of those different concentric rings that we draw out that really show us where things are. So obviously you have your center ring, and the center ring is your central business district, or your center city, or however you decide you want to say it. Okay. Outside of that, the farther you get out, you're going to get into different things. So closest thing to the city is going to be your dairy farming, and the reason it's going to be closest, and again, this is an older model, is that before we had refrigerated trucks, you had to get the milk to the market quickly before it went bad. So the dairy farming tends to be first, then you tend to have your forests. Outside of that is when you grow your crops and you have your livestock. So look back at Von Thunen's model. Very, very important model that talks about specific types of things that you see in specific places as you kind of go around a city. So it really helps to explain rural land use. This is a really significant part of how we figure out where things are associated based upon distance from markets. All right, 5.9 talks about the global system of agriculture. It says that food and agriculture products are part of the global supply chain. We talked about this a little bit before, that today we ship a lot of food in different places around the world. They ship food to us. Even if we could grow something here, we want to make sure that we don't have seasons in our food system. So if we can't grow something here in the winter, we want to be able to import that thing from a country where it's summer when it's winter here. So we're able to get those products in here. We also know that some of our developing countries, through plantation farming, are able to mass produce things like coffee and tobacco and cotton and bananas and things like that we consume a lot of in our developed countries. So all of these things are part of this global supply chain. We talked about the costs of shipping and the movement of products from point A to point B. Remember, we talked about the idea of a break of bulk point, which is kind of that point where you can move products with a lot of different modes of transportation. So whether that be taking it from a boat and putting it on a plane, or a truck, or train traffic, or whatever the case may be. So all of this is part of that supply chain and getting things from the field to the table. And that's really what's significant here. So some countries have become highly dependent on one or more export commodities. A lot of ours, particularly Central American countries, and the coffee crop are very, very dependent upon us buying that. And if we stop buying it, that would really destroy their economy. And it says here that the main elements of global food distribution networks are affected by political relationships, infrastructure, and patterns of world trade. So obviously political relationships, if there's countries that we don't like, chances are we're not going to trade with them. We trade with a lot of countries in the Caribbean, but we don't trade with Cuba because we don't like Cuba. So our political relationship with them has a significant impact on their economy, as well as some of the things that we aren't able to access that we might be able to access if we were friends with them. So political relationships are part of this global supply chain. Infrastructure. Developed countries have infrastructure. Developing countries oftentimes don't. So in developing countries, you tend to see most of the shipping come from port cities. So you have to be able to get your product to those port cities. Let's say I decide I want to have a plantation farm, and I'm in some African country that's landlocked, that's not on the ocean. How am I going to get my finished product to a place where it can be shipped? And so that idea of infrastructure and the location of countries is significant to what they're able to produce and what they're going to do. And then patterns of world trade. We've talked a lot about this year in terms of what usually gets traded from one country to another. Who produces what? If we look at the trade relationship between China and the United States, we can kind of see this, is that China tends to produce lower cost goods that can be mass produced quickly. The United States, what we trade back to them tends to be higher technology type goods that may come from here back to China, or other types of food production that we send to them because they have a large population they have to feed. So it's all part of this system that's basically set up that kind of helps everybody succeed at the end of the day. Then we have the consequences of that. What are the consequences of the way that we farm? And we talked a lot about this yesterday. So obviously we have pollution that comes from runoffs, and we have these large farms that are putting down pesticide and other things that they're using to grow their crops that can have a significant impact on pollution. Land cover change, and basically what that means is that if I go and I clear an area of trees to be able to farm there, there's going to be an environmental impact of that. You're removing the habitat of some animals. You could be removing, obviously the trees play a role in CO2 and some of the greenhouse gas removal that we see in the atmosphere. So there's a significant impact that comes from what we call deforestation, so the removal of these trees. Desertification, okay, obviously areas that we make desert-like. Now it seems that if that doesn't make sense to you, think about the Aral Sea. So the Aral Sea was that body of water in Asia that we talked about that has shrunk to 90% of its size because the Soviet Union basically drained all the water out of it to irrigate farms back in the 1950s and 60s. So what they've done is they've created a desert around the Aral Sea because they've basically removed the one water source that was used to kind of keep that area vibrant. Soil salinization. Obviously, salinization just has to do with salt. So we want to water our fields, but we don't want to water them with salt water. We see that we have these rising sea levels on Earth, and we have all of these rising, and so we have a lot of water, but it's not necessarily water that we can consume because it's salt water. So when you use that water for your fields, that obviously has an impact on the growth of products. It can obviously make it so things don't grow in that soil. And then conservation efforts, all of the different things that we're doing to try to preserve our environment, to try to preserve our green space, things like that. Those have an impact on agriculture as well. Talks a little bit here about agricultural practices, and these are all things that we've talked about. We talked about slash and burn, so the idea of cutting trees down and using that land. Terraces, that's the idea of kind of like tiered areas that you can grow on. If you look back at the picture from the agriculture chapter that I have of that flooded rice field, you can see terraces where they kind of build on different levels on that field. They kind of plant the rice and get it to start growing, and then they move it into the flooded area. So terraces are very common there. Irrigation is obviously watering of the fields. Deforestation we talked about. The draining of wetlands. That's been a significant thing that's happened in certain parts of our country. There's a big push right now to kind of return water back to the Everglades. There was a big push back in the 1950s and 60s to make the Everglades area livable. And the way they wanted to do that was they wanted to drain some of the water out of the Everglades. Now, there's obviously huge environmental impacts for doing that. As you have a lot of animals that live down there in the ecosystem, you kind of screw that up. And what we saw was that even when you drain the water, the area is a lot of it's below sea level. In the interior down there, is that you still can't grow anything. So we're now starting to go through the process of kind of reversing that process and trying to put some of the water back to where we got it from, because we realized that, okay, this didn't work. So we want to kind of restore things to the way they were. Shifting cultivation, we talked about this yesterday. That's where you grow one product for a while, then you grow something else there to replenish the soil. And then pastoral nomadism, kind of the movement of people from point A to point B. So all of those things alter the landscape of different areas. And then in the last chapter, or the last section here, it talks about some other things that influence agriculture. Obviously, one being changing diets, as Americans eat healthier and eat fewer fried foods, things like that. That increases the demand for a lot of the fruits and vegetables that farmers may produce. So that's going to have an impact on agricultural practices. Obviously, the role of women in agricultural production is going to increase the number of farmers in areas. Obviously, as the status of women in society changes around the world, that's going to have an impact here. And then the economic purpose of agriculture. If you look at some of these countries that are today agricultural based, as those countries develop, they may not be agricultural based in the future. So what we could see over time is that countries that we depend on for agricultural production may, as they develop, not produce those things anymore. So that would be kind of a consequence of development in different countries as they start to shift their focus into something else. Challenges of contemporary agriculture. Big thing here is just making sure that you know about the push today to have organic farming, things that don't use as much pesticides and herbicides. So this is all part of this new, this green revolution that we're seeing. It says agricultural innovations such as biotech, genetically modified organisms, so GMOs that we saw a lot in that Food Inc. video, and aquaculture. You remember aquaculture is when we're raising fish now for production. So instead of fishing openly in the ocean, we're raising fish in controlled environments, feeding them different things to make them bigger so that we can produce more fish for parts of the world where that is widely consumed. Obviously, there's big debates there about biodiversity issues, fertilizer and pesticide use that comes from those things. We've seen a push recently, obviously, as I said, to organic farming, local food movements, things like that. Food insecurities down here in 3 as it relates to food deserts. And the number of food deserts is doing nothing but grow as we're seeing more and more people living in areas where grocery stores are closing. And we've seen that in the Dayton area over the last year in different parts of the area. So that's contributing to food insecurities in some of those areas. And one of the big things we've seen with farming, as we've seen suburbanization and the movement of people out into different areas, is that we're taking over farmland. Is that we have land that we used to farm on, that we used to use for food production, that we're not using for food production anymore. So that's been a significant impact to how land is used and the production capacity of what we're able to produce in the United States. And then finally, women in agriculture is the last little thing here. It says a student should be able to explain geographic variations in female roles in food production and consumption. And what we see is this varies significantly based upon what's being produced. So obviously the role of women in agriculture in certain countries is significant, in other countries is really non-existent. So if you look at, there's a map that I have in the Chapter 10 PowerPoint that kind of shows you this, where women are prominent in agriculture. And what you see is that in agricultural-based societies, where women are highly valued, they're going to have a much higher role. So if you look at developing countries, such as certain places in Asia and certain places in South America, you're going to see women being much more involved than you might see in places in Africa or the Middle East, where the status of women is lower in some of those societies. So that's going to have a significant impact on the women engaged in agriculture. Okay, all right, that's Unit 5. So I've basically covered over the last week all of the units that you need for the AP test. So this is kind of just a quick overview. This is no substitute for actually going through and reviewing for this, going back through the packets that you gave. The packets that I had you do have basically all the vocabulary for this course, every single thing that you need in order to make sure that you succeed on this. So please go back through the packets and do some studying. Take a look at this stuff. If there's any specific topics that you want me to answer for Monday, go out here to this to the writing prompts form, get it out here. As of right now, I still have absolutely nothing from anybody. So that tells me that everybody's either good to go, okay, and you're comfortable, or you haven't done any reviewing at all. So one of the two, and I'm sure the majority of people are in the latter of those two categories. I know that there's a handful of people, because I'm getting emails from you, who I know are reviewing, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate you doing what you need to be doing there. But again, please communicate with your classmates to get on this stuff. We're running out of time. Okay, as of today, you got 4 days to your test, so we're getting very close to all this being finished up. Okay, if you have any questions, please email me. Otherwise, please check for that email from the College Board Sunday at 4 o'clock or later. You should have that in your email or in your Google Classroom. Please let me know if you do not have it. I'll talk to you all on Monday. Have a great day.